Yeah.
Hi everybody, today we are going to be discussing the Dyatlov Pass Incident. This is an incident where 9 Russian hikers were traversing some crazy terrain out in the northern Ural Mountains in Russia, and they were all found dead under mysterious circumstances. So we're going to be discussing their hike and what the heck happened to them today. The Dyatlov Pass Incident happened in January of 1959. 10 Russian hikers led by Igor Dyatlov set out to reach the peak of a Torton mountain in the northern Urals of the Soviet Russia. So this is dealing with a lot of Russian names. So I will probably butcher a lot of them. The group consisted of 8 men and 2 women between the ages of 20 and 38. Everyone in the group was a level 2 experienced hiker. So there were 3 different levels that you could obtain as a hiker, and they were level 2. Level 3 was the highest. They were actually going on this hike to earn the highest level they could achieve, which was level 3. The group also kept very good records in their journals. Pretty much all the hikers kept a journal, and they wrote about their travels and the hike that they were about to go on. Some of the members even had cameras that they took with them to capture special moments in this hike. This allowed the investigators after the fact to piece together the events prior to the Dyatlov Pass incident. Before leaving, Igor Dyatlov, the leader of the group, notified his sports club about the hike that they were about to take. He basically told them about the planned route and what time he was expected to be back with his group. He said that he would actually send a telegram to the club when he arrived back to the village on the outskirts of the mountain ranges, and he gave a time frame as to when he thought he would be back. Now, everyone knows when you're going on a hike like this, it's very hard and difficult, and that time frame does fluctuate by a day or two, so they weren't super concerned about it. And Igor Dyatlov and everyone that he was traveling with, they were all very experienced in hiking this terrain, so there were no worries on anyone's end. The group began their hike by traveling through a few towns to get to the furthest settlement on the outskirts of the mountain ranges. There they bought some bread and some last minute items for the hike. Before leaving, one member, Yuri Yudin, had to actually turn back due to an injury. He injured his knee and was having a lot of pain. And it was basically to the point where he knew he wasn't going to be able to make the journey. So he pulled back and told everyone that he was out. Little did Yuri know that this would basically be the last time he would see any of his friends in that group, and that he would actually be the only surviving member of the Dyatlov Pass group. On February 1st, 4 to 5 days into their journey, the group began to travel into the pass that led to a Torton mountainside. The weather actually began to change and they were caught up in a storm. The storm pretty much decreased their visibility to almost nothing, and the team deviated about 1.5 miles west from where they were supposed to be. They found themselves on a slope of a nearby mountain. Igor Dyatlov realized his mistake, and he decided that they should actually camp there for the night as the weather was bad and it was almost nightfall. So it did take them a little while to set up their tent, so he didn't want to be caught in the dark and try to make the trek back to where they were supposed to be. There was a tree line about 1 mile away from the slope they were camping on. This would have given them better cover from the elements, but would have taken time to get there, and it would have cost them some of the elevation that they had gained prior to getting to that mountainside. So they decided to, Igor basically decided this is the place we're going to set up camp. He decided the slope wasn't really an avalanche risk because it was only a 30-degree slope, and typically right around the 45-degree mark is where you really see your avalanche risk. The timeline Igor gave his sports club to communicate their safe completion of the hike had now come and gone without any word from the hikers. It was now February 20th, about 6 or 7 days past the checkpoint, and the sports club decided to form a search party because they knew that a couple days was all right, but 6 or 7 days was definitely out of the norm. So they actually gathered a bunch of volunteer rescue groups. Most of them consisted of students from the Polytech Institute, where this group of hikers, most of them actually attended this institute. So a lot of them consisted of a lot of their peers and volunteers from that group. Several days into the search, the group found the campsite, but they didn't find any of the hikers. This led to the police being called and saying, hey, something's wrong here. We found the campsite, but there's no one here to be found. The police and investigators arrived to the camp and noticed the tent was collapsed and had a light layer of snow on it, but it was not buried. So they basically suspected that the wind and the natural climate there blew the snow onto the tent. The entrance of the tent was still actually pitched up a little bit, and there was just snow that might have collapsed the backside of the tent. They also noticed the tent had almost all the hikers' belongings in it. The tent had been cut several times, which was actually later determined to be cut from the inside to get out. There were also 8 or 9 sets of footprints leading from the tent towards the tree line about a mile away. The footprints consisted of people that were barefoot or wearing socks or maybe just one shoe. It also didn't seem like the tracks were made by people that were running. It actually seemed like the footprints were spaced out to be consistent with a calm walking pace. So that led them to really kind of think that the worst was going to happen. They were going to find all these hikers that, didn't know what they were doing, and they were all going to be dead from the elements, essentially. After following the tracks to the tree line about a mile away, the investigators found the first bodies by a large cedar tree along with the remains of a small fire. The bodies that were found were Yuri Krovoshenko and Yuri Durshenko. Despite the temperatures the previous night to be about 20 below zero, both bodies were found shoeless and only wearing underwear. So very mysterious right away. These bodies are just left out there and they have no clothing whatsoever. The next 3 bodies were found between the cedar tree and the tent. Those were the bodies of Igor Dyatlov, Zenita Kilmogorov, and Rustem Slobodin. Based on the position of the bodies, their heads were actually facing towards the tent. Investigators believe that these 3 were actually trying to make it back to the tent to either find shelter or get some of the clothes and bring it back to all their other people. But they were definitely trying to make their way back to the tent somehow. These 3 were better dressed than Krovoshenko and Durshenko that were found underneath the cedar tree, but they were still well underdressed for the climate and the conditions that were on that mountainside. Medical examiners were quick to say that they all died of hypothermia, but what basically led to all the controversy is what was revealed during the autopsy and how they so easily came to the conclusion of hypothermia. Questions still loomed over the deaths of the 5 hikers that were found, but investigators knew that they were still looking for 4 other hikers. the 4 hikers that were still missing were actually found 2 months later in a ravine about 245 feet away from the cedar tree. So they were actually 245 feet deeper into the woods. The bodies were found under 13 feet of snow. This location actually became known as the Dyatlov Pass Den. The bodies consisted of Nikolai Briganolles, Lyudmila Dubinia, and Semyon Zelatarov, and Alexander Kolvatov. That was a tongue twister. The hikers that were found in the den were the best dressed of the group, but still very well underdressed. Investigators came to the conclusion that the den they made did protect them from the elements, but it still didn't protect them enough to save them from hypothermia. So they are basically saying that these 4 hikers dug this den to try to save themselves from hypothermia, but none of that information really mattered once the autopsies were completed on these bodies. To paint a clear picture of the Dyatlov Pass incident as a whole, I'm going to quickly run through a list of the victims as well as the injuries so that you can clearly understand what the investigators were dealing with and why there's so much controversy. So under the cedar tree, you had Yuri Doroshenko. He was wearing a sleeveless undershirt, short sleeve checkered shirt, he was wearing shorts and swimming trunks, blue cotton pants with a large rip in them, and wool socks on both feet. The socks on his left foot actually had burn marks in them. Hair on the right side of his head was burnt. Liver mortis spots on his body were not consistent with the position that he was found in. So this means that he was moved post-mortem. His ears, nose, and lips were all covered with blood. He had swollen lips, which were said to be consistent with injuries sustained in a fist fight. He also, mysteriously enough, he had a foamy gray fluid that was found on his right cheek. This actually started the speculation that someone or something was pressing down on his chest before his death. Apparently, according to some people, this is the type of technique used by Stalin's secret police at the time to either interrogate or torture people. That's all speculation, but it was just kind of an interesting little tidbit that I found. He also had severe abrasions on his hands and feet that were likely caused by trying to climb the cedar tree, as pieces of skin were actually found on that cedar tree, and branches from the cedar tree were broken about 10 feet up the tree. So the investigators believe that Yuri was actually trying to frantically climb that tree. He broke a ton of branches and really, cut up his hands and legs because of that. The other person found under the cedar tree had pretty similar injuries. Yuri Krivoshenko, he was wearing an undershirt, a long sleeve checkered shirt, swimming pants, long underpants, and torn socks. He had bruising and blood on his forehead and temple. Chunks of his knuckle on his left hand were actually missing. During the autopsy, it was actually found that the chunks of his knuckle were in his mouth, and this was indicating that he was biting his knuckle to either try to get the feeling back into his hands when hypothermia was starting to set in, or to stifle some sort of cry or pain that he was in to try to not make any noise. Severe hand and leg abrasions, which were most likely caused by trying to climb the tree. Severe burns on his feet, and with the small amount of clothing found on these bodies, it was thought that they might have died first and the other hikers took their clothes to keep warm. So it was thought that all the hikers were together at one point under that cedar tree, or close to it, because these bodies were moved. They were actually placed kind of in a straight line next to each other in almost like a burial type formation. So these bodies were definitely moved from one location to another, and all of their clothing was stripped off so the other hikers could stay warm. Between the cedar tree and the tent, Igor Dyatlov was found. He was wearing an unbuttoned fur sleeveless vest. I have no clue why it would be unbuttoned if you are, dying of hypothermia, but it was unbuttoned. He was wearing a blue sweater, a long sleeve shirt, ski pants, and socks. He had abrasions on his forehead and eyelids and his cheeks. He had dried blood on his lips. His hands had been cut and bruised, consistent with getting into a fist fight as well. So this is the second body now that they're saying had bruising on his hands that was consistent with a fist fight. Zinaida Kolmogorova was also found between the cedar tree and the tent. She was wearing 2 hats, a long sleeve shirt, 2 sweaters, a checkered shirt, pants, trousers, ski pants, 3 pairs of socks, but had no shoes. This is actually quite a bit of clothing to stay warm in for at least a little bit of time. Obviously, the biggest thing about that was she had no shoes on. So she was only just wearing 3 pairs of socks. I would think with the amount of clothing she actually had on, her body should be staying fairly warm. She, however, had a big bruise on her right side between her hip bone and her ribs. And this bruise was actually consistent with the shape of a baton or some other long blunt object that you would hit someone with. Her hands were torn to shreds as well, and she had a few cuts on her face. So the investigators actually called this one hypothermia as well and didn't really think anything of it. Rustem Slobodin was also found between the cedar tree and the tent. He was wearing a long sleeve shirt, a sweater, another shirt, 2 pairs of pants, 4 socks, and 1 boot on his right foot. He had hemorrhaging on his temporal lobe, blood discharge from his nose, hands were bruised and consistent with being in a fist fight, so that's number 3. He had a skull fracture on the left side of his head and a lot of swelling and abrasions on his face. After the autopsy, it was said that he would have suffered a huge loss of coordination due to the skull fracture, but it may not have killed him. The injury was consistent with falling or hitting your head on a rock or something like that, but it also said falling or hitting your head multiple times. So I'm not exactly sure what that means. His cause of death was still ruled hypothermia, even though he had a skull fracture. Lyudmila Dubinia, she was actually found in the den. She was wearing a short sleeve shirt, a long sleeve shirt, and 2 sweaters. She had on underwear and 3 pairs of socks and a pair of pants. No shoes or anything like that. Injuries consisted of soft tissue missing around her eyes, her nose, and her cheeks. Her left cheekbone was actually exposed. Her eyes were missing. Her nose was broken. Her lips and tongue were missing. In total, she had 10 broken ribs that pushed out like someone was actually stepping in the center of her chest and pushed her ribs out, causing 10 ribs to break. She had a massive hemorrhage in her heart caused by the ribs that punctured her heart. There was blood in her stomach, giving the conclusion that her tongue may have been torn out while she was still alive. The cause of death was the massive hemorrhage in her heart caused by the broken ribs. Her clothes, mysteriously enough, which this has actually been part of all of the mystery and all of the theories about the Dyatlov Pass incident, her clothes were actually tested and they were found to be radioactive. The next person that was found in the den was Semyon Zolotarov. He was wearing 2 hats, a scarf, a short and a long sleeve shirt, a black sweater, a coat with 2 upper buttons that were unbuttoned, underwear, 2 pairs of pants, ski pants, socks, and shoes. Basically, with all of his clothing and being in the den kind of out of the harsher elements, he was actually, it seemed like, warm because he had his 2 upper buttons unbuttoned from his coat. Weird. His eyes were also missing. The soft tissue around his eyes and eyebrows was missing. He had an open wound on the right side of his skull. He had 5 broken ribs on the right side. He was actually carrying a camera at the time with a pen and paper in his hand as well. So he actually had a camera around his neck with a strap, and he had a pen and paper in his hand. It is noted that the only investigator that saw the pen and paper basically said there was nothing written on it, and that was the last time anyone's ever seen this pad of paper, which is very mysterious as well. The camera was also damaged by the water that they were in. So they were in a ravine under a bunch of snow, and there was a stream that was under there as well. So the camera that he had around his neck was actually damaged by the water, and there's a lot of speculation surrounding why he grabbed a camera and a pad of paper along with a pen. And it seems like he was trying to write something as he died. So a whole lot of speculation as to, A, if something did happen, your first thought when you're cutting yourself out of the tent from the inside is, I need to grab my camera and a pad of paper, versus I need to grab all of my clothes and shoes and everything like that and get out of here, or an axe or something else like a knife that was found in the tent. He didn't have that thought. He grabbed his camera. So that's definitely one of the main, speculative things that comes out of the Dyatlov Pass incident here. The next person that was found in the den was Alexander Kolvatov. He was wearing a short and long sleeve shirt, 2 sweaters, an unzipped ski jacket, shorts, 2 pairs of pants, and socks. Again, was he toasty? I don't understand why all of these people were wearing, jackets or sweaters, and they were all either unzipped or unbuttoned. That definitely leads to the speculation as well. But apparently Alexander was cozy in the den because he didn't have time to zip his ski jacket. He had missing eyebrows along with the soft tissue around his eyebrows. It was all missing. He had a broken nose and a deformed neck. Now, it doesn't go into specifics as to why his neck was deformed or if his neck was actually broken. It just says a deformed neck. His skin was a grayish green with a hint of purple, and that was actually noted because it was different than all the other skin tones throughout all the other hikers. His sweater was also radioactive. The injuries, again, there's a lot of speculation, but it was said that the injuries were also consistent with some sort of special forces unit and how they would typically kill someone, with the deformed neck and the injuries to the face. The last person that was found in the den was Nikolai Thibeau-Brinoli. He was wearing 2 hats, a shirt, a sweater, and a jacket. Gloves were found in his right pocket of the jacket. Gloves were found in the right pocket of his jacket. His jacket was zipped though this time, so I don't know. He had underwear on and 3 sets of pants, socks, and boots. So I'm not sure why, if you're dying of hypothermia or, you know, out there in those conditions, why you would keep your gloves in your pocket, but who knows. He had multiple skull fractures. Maybe that's why. He was probably dead before he ever got tossed into the den there. He had multiple skull fractures. He had a few scratches on his face. He died of the skull fractures. The autopsy revealed that the skull fractures in his head may have been consistent with being hit in the head with a large rock, but there were very few external injuries near the fracture sites. So that leads me to believe that, you know, if you're going to hit someone over the head with a rock, it's going to actually cause abrasions and, you know, get dirt and filth in that area as well, externally. But all of these injuries were internal, and there were very few external injuries by the fractured skull. There are a ton of theories. So I want to go through some of the theories and why I have picked one, maybe two, to really stand by, and I really think that this is what happened. But I also want to note that once the investigators found all of these bodies, the Russian government actually took over the case and classified it. They didn't allow anybody to travel near the Dyatlov Pass for, I think, like 2 or 3 years. They classified all the documents, and one of the investigators actually came out afterwards and said, you know, the Russian government told me to take out anything that might have been related to like alien activity, flying saucers, any sort of Russian government activity that he put in his report. The Russian government basically told him to nix all of that and keep it quiet. So obviously you don't necessarily want to mess with the Russian government. So the investigator, of course, did that. And then, you know, years and years later, the Russian government finally caved to the pressure and released the documents and unclassified them. Now, to me, I don't trust that they actually released all of the documents, and I don't trust that the people are still seeing the full picture, especially when the investigator then finally came out and said, yeah, I had, you know, a ton of speculation about some of the things that were happening here. And some of it was like extraterrestrial, and others were part of the Russian government. So want to go through a few of the theories behind this. So afterwards, the Russian government got involved and basically said, we're going to take over this investigation. And after they did, they actually classified this as closed and said it was an avalanche. The theory goes that the hikers heard some of the snow breaking away and feared that they'd be caught in an avalanche, so they cut their tent open from the inside and made a run for it. Then the avalanche did occur, and that's what caused the injuries to the hikers. There are several key issues with this theory. So when the hikers actually built their camp, they placed all of their skis kind of in a circle, vertical, in the snow around the tent. And when the tent was found, all of the skis were still vertical. They didn't move. The snow that was actually on the tent when the tent was found to be collapsed, basically it was a light dusting of snow. You could have brushed it off with your hand. It wasn't buried under feet of snow, right? So that kind of busts the avalanche theory wide open right away. The other things that, bust the avalanche theory open are the footsteps that were headed away from the tent were measured, and the distance between each step was basically a leisure walking pace. So it wasn't someone running away. Also, the footsteps headed away from the tent were footsteps headed away from the tent. The footsteps were still there. If there was an avalanche, wouldn't those footsteps be buried under the snow? You wouldn't actually see the footsteps. There was no avalanche debris. There was nothing to indicate there was an avalanche. The other part of it was this was a 30-degree angle, and there have been multiple experts that have come out and have said this isn't anywhere close to being a risk of an avalanche area. Dyatlov Pass wasn't known for having avalanches, and to this day, I don't believe that slope has ever experienced an avalanche. So it's very hard to believe that there was an avalanche that night, and that's what caused these people to, cut their tent open from the inside and run for it. And I don't believe that an avalanche would cause the injuries that you see with some of these people. Usually the injuries that are caused by an avalanche, yeah, you might get scraped up a little bit, but typically you die from suffocation. You get buried under the snow in like a pocket. You only have so much oxygen in that pocket. And so once that oxygen is used up, if you're not found, there you go. You don't have any oxygen to breathe, and that's how you die. So the autopsy had, there was nothing in the autopsy saying that that's how they died. It was hypothermia, and then the hikers found in the den were basically trauma to the head. So I think the avalanche theory is pretty well busted at that point. The second theory is one of the bigger theories. It's actually the UFO theory. During that night of the incident, there was a photo taken on one of the cameras. It was not on the camera that was found in the den, but it was on one of the cameras that was found in the tent. The photo was very poor quality, and it's pretty speculative as to what's actually in the photo just because of the poor quality. People say a UFO was spotted by one of the hikers that got out of the tent to relieve themselves. They quickly ran into the tent to grab their camera and tell the others what they saw. The UFO then started to attack them, and this is what caused the hikers to scramble their way out of the tent without the proper clothing and cut the tent open from the inside and run for the tree line. The interesting part about this theory is it has been reported by more than one party that there were orange glowing orbs seen in the sky that night, and no one really knows what these orange orbs were, but multiple groups have come forward and have said that they saw these orange orbs. So there was definitely, I think, something out there, but I'm not sure if it was a UFO or what was going on. The other part of it, the investigator that I was talking about that actually came out and said the Russian government, tried to hush me up, but I believe it might have been UFOs. He came out and basically wrote a piece about it. He was actually the lead investigator at the Dyatlov Pass incident. He did several interviews regarding the possibility of there being a UFO as a possible explanation. During his investigation, he noticed the pine trees had burn marks at the top of the trees. He also stated that the Soviet government tried to force him to take out any reference to the unknown flying objects or other strange phenomenon in his report. So he actually had that in his report and was forced to take it out by the Russian government. This included pictures of flying spheres drawn by the Manzi people or other testimonies. So The Mansi people is basically an indigenous tribe out on the Ural Mountains that they're basically hunters, and they do these drawings on trees. These people are totally secluded from everyone else. They're known to be very friendly, but they have some of these drawings of spheres in the sky on the trees and everything else. So that was actually excluded from the reports. There's a direct quote from this investigator. He said, "I examined the scene in May. We found that some young pine trees at the edge of the forest had burn marks, but those marks did not have concentric form or some other pattern. There was no epicenter. This once again confirmed that heated beams of a strong but completely unknown, at least to us, energy was directing their firepower towards specific objects, in this case people, acting selectively." So he's basically saying there was some sort of like ray gun that these UFOs had, and they were actually shooting it at the hikers. And that's why you actually see some of the burn marks on the hikers. And this ray gun actually caused some of the head trauma that you saw on some of the hikers in the den. Some critics, though, wonder why the footprints are then at a walking pace out to the tree line. You know, if I saw a UFO and then all of a sudden it started attacking me, I'm not walking at a leisurely pace. I'm getting my butt out of there. Also, if you remember, there was a small fire that was made by the cedar tree. And to me, if I'm scared of this alien attack, why am I sitting there making a fire? You know, wouldn't that give away your position? And wouldn't, you know, that draw the alien attack closer to you if you started that fire up? The other thing with this theory is that photo that was taken that is very blurry. It does kind of depict, you know, some sort of sphere or, you know, something floating in the sky. But this photo is so blurry and it's literally just a ream of light. So you can't make anything out with it. But of course, people are going to speculate. And I actually do think the UFO theory is probably, you know, one of my top, just because it's so crazy what happened to these hikers that, to me, there are very few explanations, and the UFO theory just, I guess, makes sense. Another theory would be the parachute mine theory. This theory speculates that the campsite location fell within the path of the Russian government parachute mine experiment. This theory alleges that the hikers were woken up by loud explosions. They cut the tent open to see what the heck was going on, realized that there were explosions happening all around them, and in a panic, they ran out of the tent and down to the tree line to give themselves a little bit more protection. Parachute mines detonate while they're still in the air rather than striking something hard and detonating. And in doing so, the main injury of a parachute mine is actually the concussion blast. And this concussion blast actually causes internal injuries and not external injuries. And the reason why that's important is a lot of the injuries that were found on everyone with, you know, the head trauma and everything like that were internal, and there were very few external injuries that could explain, you know, why you could get head trauma and broken ribs and not have any external injuries. So this theory actually makes a lot of sense to me. And it also makes sense that that's why the Russian government kind of stepped in and shut the whole thing down and said, let's classify all of this. The hikers that were found in the den suffered significant skull damage in the moments before their death. And there was actually, if you remember, their clothing was found to be radioactive as well. So I'm guessing that this type of parachute mine that was used also had some sort of radioactivity happening in there. I don't know if they were trying to use some sort of radioactive weapon along with the parachute mines or what, but it definitely makes sense that this could be a possibility. Also, the reported sightings of the orange orbs floating or falling in the sky within the general area would make sense for this theory as well. So everyone that saw the orange glow and the orange orbs in the sky that night, I mean, this could have been the parachute mines by the Russian government. That's pretty much the theory that I probably hold closest to me, is that it was most likely the Russian government. I think the only thing that really gets me is, why did they walk out of the tent? The footsteps are really what gets me for this one. I can see that, you know, they cut open the tent, but for me, if we're caught in a storm of mines coming at us and there are explosions everywhere, I'm running. So it doesn't make sense to me that they would, you know, casually walk out of the tent. But everything else kind of adds up. There is another theory that there would be a Yeti. This one's pretty simple to debunk. I mean, there are no footprints. To me, if you're getting attacked by a Yeti, the Yeti is going to attack like 1 or 2 people and the rest of you can get away. And then once the Yeti attacks those 2 people, it's probably going to leave the area just like any other animal would. So that would give the other people a chance to come back to the tent and, you know, get into their warm clothing and fix the tent if it was damaged. It does not, you know, I have no clue why they would stay out after the attack happened and freeze to death. You know, also in an animal attack, if that animal attacks you hard enough to where it's crushing your skull or your ribs, usually you're going to see some sort of external damage, whether it's scrapes or scratches from their claws or bite marks or something like that. Typically an animal attack is going to be very gruesome on the outer skin as well as the internal injuries. So that kind of, I think, busts the Yeti theory open pretty well. One other theory, actually I'm going to go through 2 more theories. One other theory would be the Mansi people. We kind of mentioned it before that the Mansi tribe they were indigenous hunters that lived in the Ural Mountains. They were pretty much secluded from everyone else. It was thought that the Mansi people were angry at the group of hikers that were on their land, so they decided to kill them. The Mansi people were very widely known to be a friendly group of people and had no issues in the past with other people hiking on the Ural Mountains. So I don't know why they would have an issue with this group of people hiking in the mountains. In the diaries that were written, most of them had a list of Mansi words that could be used if they did run into any of the indigenous tribes. I'm not sure why they would have that if they didn't expect to run into them. And actually in one of the diaries, it is stated that they did see one of the Mansi people, but that person was just walking on a trail and they kind of let him go and there was nothing to it. There were no other footprints in the snow that could be found. The axes and knives that could have been used as weapons were left in the tent. So for me, you know, the Mansi people theory just doesn't really add up to being logical. Also, if you're going to have severe head trauma and things like that, even with a human attacking you, I'm sure you're still going to sustain a lot of external injuries as well. So it just doesn't make sense to me. The last one that I'm going to talk about, which to me can also be one that I might put in the top of my list, is actually the Russian government. So it was basically thought that one of the or some of the hikers were actually part of the Russian government and spies, and they came across a secret, weapons lab or whatever in there, or even that these spies had a mission to kill all these hikers, and that's kind of what they did. So all the injuries that you saw on some of the hikers, where it was the distorted neck and a few of the facial injuries, were very consistent with how some of the special unit forces at that time would kill people. However, I go back to the theory of, if you're in hand-to-hand combat, being two humans in hand-to-hand combat, I think you're going to sustain way more external damage. If there's force enough to smash someone's skull open with like a rock, or even your fists, which I don't think would happen, but even if it was, you're still going to get some sort of external damage. So the force that it takes to actually crush someone's skull and to give the fractures that were seen on some of these victims, you're going to have to use a blunt object, I think. And I think that blunt object would cause a lot of external damage as well. So I think that kind of rules that one out. So basically, I'm telling you, I'm going with either a UFO or the parachute mines, probably leaning more towards the parachute mines. But who knows? I mean, what are your thoughts on any of the theories that you've heard? If you're familiar with this story. Otherwise, if you're not familiar with the Dyatlov Pass incident, tell me what your thoughts are now. What are some theories that you think might have happened? Or, take a look at some other videos across the web and share your thoughts here. That is all I had about the Dyatlov Pass incident, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I would love it if you gave it a like and subscribe to my page. Otherwise, have a great day, everyone. Thanks for watching.